What's going on, everybody, and welcome to episode 74 of the Book Binge this week for another discussion type video, but this time answering a question that I actually haven't gotten requests necessarily to answer, but a question that I thought would be interesting to discuss for one of these Thursday episodes. That, of course, being, just as the title said, how do I determine my TBR? This is going to go into a few things, but a lot of it is going to go with how I prioritize my reading and therefore what actually gets put onto my TBR each and every month. As many people who are watching this video might already know about me, is that I have a somewhat small reputation for reading very slow. I don't actually have a reputation for that, but I make it quite clear all the time that I read incredibly slow, and it's a lot of the reason why I have to push off buddy reads or read alongs that I would otherwise like to join is just because I can't read 10 books every month. Boy, do I wish I could read 10 books every month, but as things stand, 3 to 5 books a month is more like how things go most of the time. I've also been, sort of halfway criticized for not immediately prioritizing everything that my friends love and, all of the books that I own that I need to get through. Trust me, I beat myself up enough for it. You don't need to also beat me up for it either. But with that being said, I did want to talk about what sort of making my TBR is made of, the sort of portions of the process that go into it, whether or not I prioritize it. How do I prioritize it, and why do I do it that way? Do I feel bad when something doesn't make the cut, or when I have to push something back, or how do I determine if something gets pushed back, or, all of that fun stuff. So let's start this off with, do I prioritize my reading? Why or why not? The short answer, yes. The long answer, yes, I do. I feel like when I look at past reading experiences when I was younger, kind of before this sort of revival of sorts back in 2021, mid 2021, late 2021, whenever you want to consider that as having happened, mood reading turns out was kind of detrimental to the way that I read. I would, be kind of like my mother in that I would have as many as 8 or 9 books going at once on my nightstand and then proceed to not finish pretty much any of those books at all. Like, they would just all be sitting there, and I would cycle through which ones are just like, okay, well, I just haven't finished this and have been interested to pick it back up for another chapter. I'd return that one to the library, grab another one, and start the whole process over again. Just kind of have a whole circle, a cycle of 8 or 9 books, like I said, just all going at once. If I ever had less than 5 books going at once, it was kind of insane. This was when I was a bit younger, but that was kind of just how things were. When I got back into reading, I knew that that wasn't going to work. And it didn't, the idea of doing that just didn't seem attractive to me, alongside the fact that I, like I said, knew that that just wasn't going to work. So now it's more or less one book at a time. And I've kept that rule more or less consistent for most of the time that I've been reading since then. Sometimes I'm a bit more flexible, reading 2 or even 3 books at once, depending on what's going on and depending on how you determine reading 2 or 3 books at once to mean, but usually I keep it at one. Recently, I got up to having 5 books going on at the same time, although one of those doesn't count in the same way. But yeah, that was starting to get a bit stressful. So if I can have that currently reading section on Goodreads at 3 or less, with one of those being the Bible, just kind of constantly, with so basically 2 books, one or just 2 books going on. Otherwise, that would be pretty nice. Now, the next question is, how do I prioritize what I read? Since I just mentioned that I obviously do that, and more specifically tend to prioritize reading 1, maybe sometimes 2 books at once. A lot of it does come down to, at this point, managing my FOMO, or fear of missing out, for the few of you who might not know what that term means. Don't get me wrong, I still feel FOMO a lot, quite constantly, from a lot of different people, but I have learned when the TBR matters more than random FOMO that crops up at random points in time, which admittedly is nearly always. And when I say is nearly always, I mean like the TBR matters more than the FOMO nearly always, not that there's nearly always FOMO, even though there is quite frequently some of that going on. But there are some things that I do always have going on in my month-to-month reading, starting off with things like monthly classics. So I basically am reading a classic nearly every single month, if not more than that, which has started to get a bit unwieldy, and in 2024, I might be cutting back on that quite a bit, if not partway through this year. Like, who knows? there've been so many of those that I've been interested in reading and people have been picking up, and depending on votes and what else has been going on my TBR, it's been a lot to deal with. So even the monthly classics was just kind of been a staple in my TBR for well over a year now. Then I almost always have like a primary series per se going on. So like Dark Tower in the first 7 months of 2022, I had one of those going on each month. Then I did Sun Eater for the next like the next 7 months or something like that after that, with the five main novels and then novellas and short stories and stuff. So about 7 months after that. And then starting soon, which I guess is kind of a spoiler for next Thursday's video, I'm going to be starting Wheel of Time, and that's going to become the primary series that kind of becomes a staple in the TBR as well. Beyond monthly classics and main primary series, I also have secondary series and or standalones that I'll put into the mix when time allows, or that I'll push back when time allows, or when time doesn't allow, rather, or various factors related to that. So stuff like Rick Riordan series, additional classics depending on what's going on, catching up on classics that I missed, or just throwing in a random book that I really wanted to read, or if there's like a buddy read that I want to do of a random standalone book, I can throw that in, or whatever the case may be. For me, the primary series is the most important entry each month. If there's anything that I'm unable to do, I'm going to push back. Like if there's only one book that I can read each month, it's going to be the book in the primary series. So Dark Tower or Sun Eater for 2022, and then of course the beginning of 2023 was that priority. If there's going to be a book that I have to push back and I only have, okay, let's put this a different way. If I have scheduled a book in the primary series, a monthly classic, and then a standalone, obviously that standalone is going to be pushed back first, but then because the primary series is the primary focus, the classic is the one that gets pushed back next. So that's the secondary focused one. It comes right down to it. I try not to fall behind on them, but sometimes I do, depending on reading slumps and what's going on. Like I had to push back Count of Monte Cristo because I was in a reading slump at the time that was going on, and therefore I just didn't have time to fit it in. I had to push back A Tale of Two Cities because having two classics read in that month was really not a great decision in my opinion, and now I have to catch up on a classic because there were two classics to read that month. And then there were other examples of, similar occasions. Like I said, I try not to fall behind, but sometimes I do, depending on what's going on. Then finally, the final focus, the tertiary focus, I suppose, is where the standalones and then secondary slash backup series, they all become a tertiary focus. So they're things that are the most tentatively placed in the TBR, like if I have time. So that's stuff like Rick Riordan. These are the most likely to be pushed back, like I said, if time is lacking, and they are usually the most flexible to fit in on a moment's notice in any given month if extra time is had, because most of the books that fall into these categories are shorter or easier, and I think that kind of works well enough. If I have a primary series that's pretty long or hard or whatever that's going on, and then I have the monthly classics, if I have to fit something in each and every month, then I can make it something that's a little bit quicker or easier, just for the sake of having quicker and easier before I go into the next months of heavy reading. But what about when something doesn't make the cut? Well, sometimes I am excited to read something, but I don't have time, just as everybody has surely experienced. I tend to simply just push them back to a later month, sometimes very begrudgingly. An example of this is books that you might be able to see right up here on the shelf, like just at the bottom of them. It's the Legacy Trilogy by Matthew Ward. That's a trilogy that I really, really wanted to be able to read this year in 2023, but I am like absolutely certain that I will not be able to, so I'm very begrudgingly pushing them back vaguely into 2024. Sometimes that's what I have to do. Sometimes I have to play things by ear based on where the hype is amongst friends. Also, recently I've had to turn down tons of interesting reads because I don't have time to do so. So that's unfortunate. Like a bunch of things that are like, okay, well, in different circumstances, I would love to have done this for a buddy read, but I just can't afford to right now, so I'm not going to. Sometimes I'm just not in the mood for one of my primary focuses to read. This was what happened with Tides of War by Stephen Pressfield. I started reading that and like, holy cow, it just was not working. I still don't know if I fully DNF'd that or not, but definitely been pushed back. Like, I decided, like, I'm just not going to read that this month. I'm going to start reading something else early instead. Uh, in the cases of that happening, which is pretty rare, mind you, I will either add something else instead, or like I said, I'll start my next read early. So that's kind of what happens when things don't make the cut or just aren't working. But how do mood reads affect my TBR? Since I mentioned that, early in this video, that when I got back into reading, I knew that just solely mood reading and just, picking up books just based off of what's interesting wasn't going to work for me. So how do mood reads affect my TBR? This is primarily where my secondary series and fall alone stand, that sort of tertiary focus. I don't let my mood decide too much of my TBR, all things considered. I just try not to, and that's where I've had to get a little bit better in recent months at just ignoring or dealing with FOMO. Even if people are reading a book that I just would really like to be able to read with them, sometimes it's just like, well, sorry, if we had determined this like 6 months ago and I didn't already have my TBR for the next 3 months already, figured out pretty much more or less exact, I would try to join in better. But as things stand, I'm just not going to try because it would mess everything up. So unless I know far ahead of time that I want to do stuff or want to give myself time to be able to mood read a little bit more, I generally don't let it affect my TBR too much. And then, of course, we come to basically the final section of this video, and what I was originally going to title this video before I decided it didn't make sense since it was only one part of the video. How far in advance do I build my TBR? Since, it really depends what I've got on deck, and because I do a monthly TBR video each video, and or each month, and then I have had videos in the past where I've mentioned, like, I would like to get to this in like 7 years, and that's like an oddly specific number, so it's kind of strange. But like I said, it really kind of depends on what I've got on deck. When it comes to my primary series, I tend to have those set in stone for a long time ahead, as long as it needs to be. So for Dark Tower, that was part of a read along, but that was my primary series for January through July of 2022. So that was like set in stone for 7 months. Same thing with Sun Eater. Then I joined slash became the head of the Sun Eater read along somewhere in like June or so. And that meant that I was locked in for Sun Eater being my main series from August through February of 2023, as early as June of 2022. So for well over half a year, I had that locked in and set in stone. And now that I'm going to be starting Wheel of Time soon, that's going to be my main series for quite a long time, as you might see in next week's video. Since these series are obviously my primary focus, those obviously take, the majority of the TBR and are planned pretty far in advance. Monthly classics are also kind of as far as ahead as they can be because they're monthly classics, so it's like I'm going to have a slot in my TBR each month for the monthly classic, whatever it is. But depending on when those get voted is when, that's actually planned in the TBR. That's just kind of playing it by ear for the most part. The secondary series and standalones are the most just figuring it out as I go. Some are planned super far ahead of time. Some I don't really decide until a couple weeks before, or even like a couple days before. Like if I'm like, okay, I'm going to have 5 days after I finish this book before next month, do I want to start next month's book early? Or do I just want to fit in this book because I can and because I want to? Or in other cases, it'll be like, well, I know that I want to read The Kane Chronicles and Percy Jackson and the Olympians by Rick Riordan this year. That's what I said in 2022. When am I going to do it? So in last January, I just started fitting them in when I could and got through those in a few months. That's just kind of how it happens sometimes. And it'll be a somewhat similar thing for me this year because I have other series planned that I would like to get to this year, including Underland Chronicles and Heroes of Olympus that are smaller and more variable and much more easy to fit in a moment's notice. So those are kind of plans that are just like, I would like to get to them sometime this year, but we'll see kind of what the TBR shows. But then there's another example that's just like, well, this is kind of planned a little bit ahead of time, like Faithful and the Fallen. I know approximately when I'll be able to read most of those books this year, but of course, still have to rely mostly on the primary series and the classics for the moment. But now you have at least a little bit more info on how I determine my TBR if you were a little bit interested in that. There's various factors at play, obviously. I hope you found all of these various independent factors learning about them a bit interesting. Of course, I'd be more free to mood read or read along much more often if I didn't have the monthly classics, but that's all fine. This is how I determine my TBR. Let me know in the comments below if you have some sort of system, whether you realize it or not, on how you determine what you read next and whatnot. Like, do you just have a bookshelf that is just dedicated to all the books that you haven't read yet that you would like to read, and then you just pick one up when you're done? Like, is that something you do? Let me know. I would be very interested. Also, let me know if there's some more of this sort of somewhat behind the scenes stuff that you would like to see, these discussion videos, like ask me questions, things that I might be able to answer. I'd love to be able to do some of that as well. So thank you guys for watching. I'll be back on Tuesday with a review of The Master and Margarita, which is a very strange book, but that is what is going to be coming out next. Thank you guys for watching. I'll be back in the next video.